our topic is Jack the Ripper, and I know a lot of you have probably at least heard about them, but I'm sure there's a lot you don't know, which is what we'd like to explain today. So, I'm going to do the victims, and he's got 3 early victims that aren't actually confirmed as his, but are probable or possible, so we're going to go ahead and do this. Annie Millwood was a prostitute, of course, and she was stabbed in her legs and the lower part of her abdomen on February 25th, 1888, which is when all of these murders took place. And so she made it to the infirmary, but later succumbed to her wounds. So they think it might be her because she was found in Whitechapel. And Ada Wilson was also a prostitute who was killed after opening her door at midnight, and her throat was slashed. I don't actually have a picture of it, but this is what it's recreated as. And so they think it was also her because she was found at Whitechapel in early 1888. And then Emma Elizabeth Smith was a prostitute who was assaulted by a gang, is what she reported. And she made it to the hospital and actually survived for a couple of years until she later died from an unrelated infection. And this is probably the least probable of the attacks because it was a gang, obviously. Alright, so Martha Taverin was found in George Yard buildings on the first floor landing August 7th, 1888. And there wasn't really anything too special about her death, but it's one of the most likely of his first kills. And then Mary Nichols was found in a gateway in Bucks Row on August 31st, 1888. And she was the first of his 5 canonical victims, or the ones that they know that he did. So Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. And according to the police report, she was horribly mutilated, and the killer made off with her wound. So, Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard on September 30th, 1888, and her throat had been cut, but there were no other mutilations, so they believed that he had been interrupted during his attack. And then Catherine Eddowes was found in Meter Square, London, and her face was extremely mutilated, and the victim's uterus and left kidney were taken. And then Mary Kelly was found November 9th, 1888, in her room in Miller's Court, and the police report said that she had been virtually skinned to the bone, and she was the last of his 5 canonical victims. Alright, and then these are his possible later victims, but they're not actually confirmed as his. So Alice McKenzie was found July 17, 1889 in Whitechapel, and it prompted speculation that he had returned. And then Franz Cole was found February 13, 1891 beneath a dark railway arch in Swallow Gardens, and the police actually charged and arrested a sailor named James Thomas Sadler with the murder. So everyone kind of thought that he had been apprehended and was kind of gone. So,
Alright. One police officer was reported saying the difficulty of our work is much greater than the general public are aware. The investigating officers in Jack the Ripper case were and widely are criticized for never actually convicting anyone for the murders. However, there were many factors surrounding the crimes that made the case nearly impossible to solve. For the first case, basically, the investigating officers really didn't have any of the modern tools that we have today. They didn't have any DNA evidence or fingerprints or anything like that. In fact, they didn't really even take pictures of the bodies. When they got to a scene and they found a body, most of the time the purpose was to get rid of the body as quickly as you could so that there would be no public outcry. So the only pictures that they have, which Alan had on his PowerPoint, were morgue pictures. That was after they got the body back to the police station and took the body, like a picture of it then. There was only one victim that was actually taken, like a picture was taken at the scene of the crime, and there was a picture taken of her eyes so that they could maybe see what she last saw, aka her killer. But of course that didn't work because that's obviously just a rumor that you could do that. Now, they really couldn't judge who the killer was based on the victims, because although they had the commonality of being prostitutes in Whitechapel, there really wasn't anything else to go on there, so the murderer probably wasn't an acquaintance of the victims unless he was a client. So the only thing they could do was ask around and see if anyone had seen anything, and the public wasn't really forthcoming with that information. Now, there were two groups of investigators that were involved in the case. The first was the Metropolitan Police, and this is a picture of all the men who were involved during the Jack the Ripper case. And they were involved in the first 4 murders of the victims because they were mostly for the district of Whitechapel. They were called in because it was their area to investigate. But then when Catherine Dowers was murdered, that actually brought in the City of London Police. It was all those, and they were more of the general kind of federal police force that investigated on a broader terms. So you had 2 departments working together, and they really didn't get along that well. They were all fighting with each other, and the person who was supposed to be head of the entire investigation was a man named Anderson, and unfortunately he left for Switzerland the year that the murders occurred, and like about a month before the murders occurred, so they had absolutely no leadership, and they were fighting with each other a lot. And then they also had the added trouble of the press. Now, the police really didn't trust the press because if they gave them any information, they were worried that the press would put something in a report and then the criminals would escape because they knew that the police was coming after them. So the press wouldn't get any information from the police, so they would just have to make up rumors and lies and everything. And this kind of started the huge Jack the Ripper legacy of everyone getting to know it and it becoming popularized. And so letters were being sent to the police stations to where they would have to investigate all these letters. There were 700 letters sent, and 300 of them were prank letters. And a lot of the times there would be organs with the letters, sometimes animal and sometimes human. But the 2 most popular letters were the Dear Boss letters and the Letter from Hell. The Dear Boss letter actually popularized the name Jack the Ripper because that's who it was signed from. And the Letter from Hell actually ended with "Catch me if you can," which was a threat basically saying, "You're never going to catch me, you're going to fail miserably." So it obviously doesn't seem like they would have really made any progress in this case, but they did manage to find a few victims and suspects.
Alright, so there have been many people named as Jack the Ripper, from the author Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, to Prince Albert Victor. However, for every piece of evidence that is proposed to support somebody as the suspect, there always seems to be just as much evidence that says why they aren't the Ripper. While a case can be made for several suspects, others cannot be taken seriously. Nonetheless, the following 3 men are widely accepted suspects for Jack the Ripper. First is Montague John Druid. He worked as a lawyer and as an assistant schoolmaster in London, and then on November 30th, 1888, he was dismissed from his job at the school. It is suspected that this was due to homosexual tendencies. And then on December 31st, 1888, his body was found floating in the River Thames. Stones found in his pockets had kept his body weighted down for about a month. It hadn't appeared. And then multiple police officials during this time had made references that the Ripper had escaped justice by committing suicide. There was a common belief that he had drowned himself in the river. And this is why he was mainly proposed as the suspect for the Ripper, because he died right around the time that the murder stopped. However, there is basically no other evidence to support him as the suspect. Next guy is Søren Klasowski. He was born in Poland and became apprenticed to a doctor at age 14. This gives some credibility to him because the Ripper seemed to have some knowledge of anatomy due to his dissecting some of the bodies. He worked as a doctor's assistant until he immigrated to London in 1888. This was at the point that he changed his name to George Chapman. And then during this time, a little bit afterwards, he poisoned 3 of his wives between 1897 and 1902, and then he was hung in 1903. He was also reported as a misogynist who regularly beat his wives and then was prone to other violent behavior. And then he allegedly strangled one of his wives and then actually had a knife and planned to behead her, but a customer came into his store and their room was adjoined to the store, so he was interrupted from that. It's doubted that he was the Ripper because it's very unusual for a serial killer to change their tactic of murdering somebody. So in this case, he would have gone from brutally mutilating some people to poisoning, which is highly unusual. And then the third one is Francis Tumblety. Francis was an Irish-born American who posed as a doctor throughout the United States and Canada. He was known for having an extreme hatred towards women, especially prostitutes. He spoke out against them frequently. And then he also kept a collection of uteruses and jars in his home, which he proudly displayed to guests. He visited Europe several times and was a resident of a boarding house in Whitechapel at the same time as the Jack the Ripper murders. He was arrested on November 7th, 1888 for being caught in a homosexual encounter, but then when he was let out on bail, he fled to France and then back to the United States, which corresponds with the 5 canonical murders stopping. And then they tried to extradite him back to Great Britain for trial for the Jack the Ripper murders, but there was pretty much no other evidence against him, so he ended up dying in the United States in the early 20th century. All right, so these 3 men were just, these were just 3 of the men of the dozens proposed as Jack the Ripper. However, their verdict is still out, and there's no conclusive evidence pointing to just one person. In the meantime, Jack the Ripper has become a figure of pop culture, appearing in books, movies, and even plays.
Oh, no, not once. Oh, sorry. Okay.
So, Jack the Ripper has been featured in many fiction and non-fiction things, and a lot of this information varies from fact to fiction, so a lot of it is mainly just legend rather than actual facts about the Ripper. The Ripper has obviously been written about in newspapers because they had to tell the people what was going on, and a lot of these newspapers honestly came around after the murders just to tell about what had happened. And there are several books. One of them is called From Hell, and another is Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, which I've heard is really good, so if anybody wants to read that. And then there have been several plays, like Jack the Ripper, The Monster of Whitechapel, and Murder Most Foul. And even movies, Unmasking Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones. And some songs have been written about Jack the Ripper, like Jack the Ripper by Ling Frey and London in Terror by Motionless in White. There have been a few television shows that have either been all about Jack the Ripper or have had an episode about Jack the Ripper, like The Twilight Zone, the new exhibit starring Martin Balsam was an episode based on Jack the Ripper and his murders. And Star Trek even had an episode about Jack the Ripper. There have been many poems written about him, like Jack the Ripper by Georges and An East End Tragedy by Smith. And there are even video games, which I find a little creepy, about Jack the Ripper, like Jack the Ripper for Windows, and Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper for Microsoft and Xbox. People have also written things that are supposed to be from the perspective of the Ripper, like the letters that April was talking about, and they don't always find these to be true things, so they're just in like museums and stuff that people can see and visit. And Jack the Ripper is the most written about crime of the past century in books and movies and plays, like I said. And there are even guided tours of the different murder sites in East London. Like you can go on one of those ghost walks, as they call it, in London and visit different places that people were murdered. Many famous works have been written about the Whitechapel murder, but this unidentified killer also comes very close to home, as I don't know if any of you ever saw it, but Diana Evans used to have a routine that was based on Jack the Ripper as well. So it goes all the way from famous movies all the way down to a nearby dance studio, and it has reached us in the United States as well as is still all over England. Thank you.